podcasts have very quickly become a very normal part of our listening life. But the market is so huge. I don't know about anyone else, but I confess that I often find it very hard to see the wood for the trees and just get tremendously confused by the range of things on offer in the podcasting world. And our next contributor is on a mission to help people like me, which is great. Gerard Edwards is CEO of Podcast Radio, a speech-based radio station showcasing and programming podcasts like other stations program music. And I'm guessing he listens to a lot of podcasts. So you, Gerard, are the perfect person to give us top 10 tips for great podcasts. So I will hand over to you and listen with interest, hanging on your every word.
Thank you very much. Well, it's interesting, actually. I started as a broadcaster in New Zealand, of all places. So I come from a radio broadcast background. And I was young enough, I hope, to see that podcasting was coming in as a challenge to radio and TV and even anything internet related, video related. It was coming in fast. And I was an early adopter of, well, being cautious of it. And the reason no huge company has been able to really grab podcasting and own it. Spotify is trying, Apple was somewhere in the lead. But the reason no company owns podcasting per se is because no one expected Gen Z and millennials to slow it down. No one thought that age was willing to listen to two people or one in a monologue to listen for about an hour on almost one subject and go in depth and go down these avenues and see what a thought process was like and hearing it being figured out. And it was an interesting one. That's where podcasting came from. That's its strength. Its strength is that it's passionate. And you can't then have that in theory on radio because you couldn't explore an idea for 90 minutes with no end game on radio. We've booked that trend of podcast radio. We went and got ourselves channels. We're now in Manchester, Glasgow, Surrey, London, missing one. And we just launched in Birmingham last week. And we just had a Forbes article written about what we're doing. But what we're actually doing is making a schedule using radio channels, allowing those programs airtime, so people can figure them out, meet them. So yes, we do. To answer the question, yes, we do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I'll try and share my screen. So we're going to go through some top tips, if we can, about what it means and what we've discovered across our year of being podcast radio. And if anyone's got any questions, feel free to fire them at me if I've got a minute at the end to explain more, because we know it's confusing. Podcast radio plays podcasts on the radio so people can hear more. And there are millions, quite literally millions of them. So I'll race through and just some quick tips, hopefully. Remember this. There are, and I'll use this little pointer up here, there are 9 million British people every week listening to a podcast. So if you can be amongst them, why wouldn't you be? The US are ahead of us. They've got 105 million Americans listening to podcasts every month, and Australia catching up. 16 million Australians listen to podcasts every month. I think there are only 22 million Australians. So it is really this thing that has come out of nowhere. And it means it's not really driven by commercialist opportunity, as I say, because no one expected it. So it's got this opportunity that nothing else has. So the tips we've got at Podcast Radio: be original. You come up with an idea, you want to start a podcast. If there's a podcast out there doing what you're doing, or if there's a podcast that sounds like you, then yes, go and grab some good ideas from them. But somewhere in there is your chance to make something no one else ever has made or is making. So be original. It's not an easy tip, of course, to be original. Audio quality, and I'll race through these because I've only got another 5 minutes. I think I've been banging on, sorry. Audio quality matters. It really does matter. Little note down there in the bottom right. The reason we say that is the first thing we look for is we click on a piece of audio. Does it sound nice? Before you know their subject, before you recognize the accent, before you do or don't fall in love with what they're talking about, the audio quality will be there. And it's not like TV. You can click Netflix or throw on a TV channel. You can see if it's HD, high definition or not. Audio's a different tool. And podcasting is still catching up with that. And, you know, your BBC radios sound amazing. They've got all the processors going. And what our tip as a podcast radio, audio quality matters so much, but don't spend your money on it. Just watch a 10-minute explainer video. You'll pick up skills if you go. Don't be afraid of it. If someone sounds better than yours, it isn't because they're spending more money. They've probably spent 10 minutes more figuring out why it should sound better. I hope I'm sounding good actually now. Lift ideas. So you want to start a podcast, or your podcast you're making is a little bit of a struggle. you're feeling like you might be running out of steam. Lift ideas could also is a nice way of saying steal ideas, if I could say that. You know, in art we say it's inspired by. In business we say someone stole something. But lifting ideas from other podcasts, see what they do. See why people may have fallen in love with theirs, with another podcast, for instance. See why another podcast has got all those listeners. And it's not always just big guests, but there are lots of other reasons why too. If you can go and listen and tell yourself or explain to yourself or question why someone else is loving another podcast, then there's your answer. Try that on yours. Test it out. Now, as I say, podcast radio has never been done. We are the world's only channel, the only platform with radio stations attached to it, where our job is to have listeners there who are looking for a new podcast, or just throw it on for 6 hours a day and we'll hear about 9 podcasts in a row with the news in between and a presenter introducing it. But what we've found is we're talking to podcasters and we're checking and testing podcasts a bit differently. And the big thing for me is test your podcast in this way. You've made it. Perhaps you've given it an edit. It sounds good because you checked that note before I said about audio quality. Would you listen to it? And that is one of the biggest tests in just about any medium. Would you willingly listen back to that hour? You said it. Those were your thoughts. That was your idea. And quite a few, sad to say, both TV, radio do it. They wouldn't. And so podcasting is really amazing. You make it because you love it. You fall in love with it. Even if a business is starting a podcast, it should be because they believe in it. So your podcast isn't just to sell ad space. It's because you're passionate about it. And if your test is you are passionate about it, but you wouldn't listen back to your own episode, then you're probably not on the right track. The question then is, do you like it? Being consistent in podcasting isn't easy, because a week is a lot shorter than people think it is. And if you say to your listeners, or you promise to yourself, I'm going to release every Friday morning, weekly for the foreseeable future, that's a big commitment. The consistency, though, is what will get you listeners, because they also want consistency. They want the episode when you promise it's going to be, each time, each week. You could, of course, put one out once a month, 12 times a year. But consistency is key, so you can point to it so people know what's coming, because you aren't a radio station. You aren't a TV channel with a schedule. Be consistent in your podcasting, and that can be flexible too. You can change those parameters, but you have to promise to yourself and keep it up to be consistent for a good podcast. Patience. I mean, some of these just sound like virtues now, don't they? Be patient. There are 2.2 million podcasts right now. That will be 3 million before you know it, 4 million. If you're starting one, you'll be one of them. If you're already one, you may be feeling like it's struggling to be seen or being noticed, and then, of course, being heard. But patience is really, really important, especially it's easy to trip up. If you have started a podcast, it's because you're passionate. But if you're feeling a bit like, where do I go next with it? Be patient. People will pick it up. It's the opposite of a ratings on TV in podcasting, where they say, 9 million people watched XYZ last night, Line of Duty, for instance. Patience really matters in podcasting. Just be consistent, put it out. And when someone discovers one bit of your content or one episode, you then have a new listener who may listen to all of the episodes. Now, I've only typed these slides today, so I really hope there are no typos. I should have checked that, shouldn't I? Bust a myth, and this is myth busting here. Just get to it. If you start a podcast episode and your subject is about, the clouds, just start talking about clouds. No one wants to hear 5 minutes of banging on. And I know I did it in my little speech here. I started talking for about 5 minutes, didn't I, before getting to the slides. So maybe I'm guilty. We're all guilty of it, but just get to it, because there'll be so much content in the episode. You don't have to fill it out. And if you run out of things you've talked about, then have a short episode. Rules are out the window with podcasting, and it's refreshing and daunting for new podcasters and old podcasters alike. But the rule book's gone. It's you and your listener. And so I've got some quick fire ones here. The audio X factor. Podcasting is excellent because it's in audio. Sure, you can add a video. You can add your tweets and your Facebook posts around it. But it's because it's the human voice. People are listening to you for the human voice, and they're listening for a lengthier stay than radio or watching a half-hour TV program. They're there with you for a reason. And we've fallen in love again with the human voice in podcasting. And that's where I love it. I love that this trend came out of nowhere, that we're falling in love with people again. And that's because there's a connection. When you make a podcast, if you want to read down this list with me, it's you and your listener with no interference. And, it's not like commercialized stuff where there are ads every 12 minutes per se. It's you telling a story or you consuming a story as the listener. And it's a close bond. The human voice, there's nothing like it. The robots may be taking the checkouts, but they're not taking podcast positions yet, because the human voice just has everything in it. And we can tell with the slightest inflection whether someone's sad. When someone cries on a podcast, you can really feel it, which is amazing. There is a market need. Everyone's doing it. So get on board. Just like having a website once upon a time. If you didn't have one and you don't have one now, then you're thinking, uh-oh, yeah. If everyone's doing it, you've got to get on board. And that's where podcasting is right now. That's not me saying you have to do it, of course. You can go against it. But there are people now, me included, who notice if a brand or a company or an organization, religion or not, it doesn't have a way to give its message in human voice directly on demand to a listener. And you can call them consumers, you can call them members, whatever you want to call. But if you're not allowing your human voice and your story to be told how you would like it to be told, then you're missing a trick. And a lot of other people and organizations are. It does mean with that, by starting a podcast or being in podcasting, you're a first mover. You are still early into it. You might be the first of your type. And if you can be the first of your type, for instance, Johnny Gould, who has been a broadcaster for years, has a phenomenal podcast called Johnny Gould's Jewish State for Jewish listeners and non-Jewish listeners alike. And you get to either come in, be a bit nosy, see what's happening. He'll talk to 80s rock stars. He'll talk to politicians from the Middle East. Big conversations, and you don't have to be Jewish because it's big newsworthy stuff too. But he was a first mover. I think his podcast is the biggest English language Jewish podcast outside of the US. And although I've put a few parameters on that, it is big. And he did so because he was the first guy to do that. And it's on the go. People consume, there's a typo, I did consume. I knew I'd get one. People consume audio when they like. And this is really important in podcasting. You listen in your kitchen while you're doing the dishes and you can have a good time. Now, that has really bent the rules. Yes, that could be radio. Yes, that could be music. But with podcasting, people listen on the go to what they like. So you could expand your mind. You could listen to philosophy whilst going for a jog. And if you don't like jogging, what a thing to both work out your mind and your legs and your overall health. And so that's my personal feeling for podcasting. I think that's the power of it, that you can use it wherever you like. And I think in turn, I think that's why you've got to be amongst it. And hopefully I've picked up some tips from me today. Quickfire, I know. To remember all of those things, not necessarily to spend a lot of time on them, but just to keep them in mind. And if you always think your podcast can get bigger and better and affect more people, the short answer is yes, it can. And a podcast radio, I'll quickly race through this. If you are still thinking, how does a radio station play podcast and do podcasting? We're the first ever platform for discovering and promoting podcast. When you click in and listen, it sounds amazing because it sounds like every subject under the sun. We're the first, we're the best, we're the only one. So I would say that in the world. And the opportunity in podcasting is huge. In the next 5 years, just watch the advertising spend flood in, I would say. That's probably enough for me. I'll stop sharing. Yeah, I think, is that enough?
No, that was fantastic. But we've got about 1 minute, and I'd like to just ask you a question, which is from the point of view of people like me, listeners to podcasts, late adopters, to be fair, but who look at the range of podcasts that are out there and feel completely overwhelmed. Have you got any kind of tips for us as listeners?
Yeah,
how we see the wood for the trees in all this? Because I'm sure other people feel like this is too. It's just overwhelming.
Yeah, the first thing is not to be scared of it. I know that sounds ridiculous as a tip, but just go into Spotify, Apple, or whatever you use, or just Google a podcast and maybe just add in a genre or a subject. If you like football, just look up football podcasts and try it and press play. Now, I'm not saying everyone will, but the whole point of podcast radio is that problem. People drop in and listen, and it's after 3 or 4 minutes into a podcast, you go, oh, this is interesting. I like the dynamic of them. which is why all of our tips are based around that. But for total new adopters as listeners, just go to where podcasts live. Try Spotify or Apple Podcast first, or Google Podcast has caught up, and just give a search for a subject you like. And before you know it, you'll have fallen in love with it. David Tennant is a good example. He's got his own podcast talking to other celebs. If you want to start somewhere that you recognize a voice, or Doctor Who fans, that's always a good one, because it's not about Doctor Who, but you'll all of a sudden realize you've become a podcast listener.
Brilliant. So not just a subject, but a personality as well.
Yeah. And it doesn't always have to be not just celebrities. We're big on that. Not just celebs, because it's great finding new stuff too. Fantastic.
Gerard, thank you very, very much for joining us. That was fantastic. And I will be emboldened.
Thanks. Great to be here. Cheers.
Wonderful. Thank you.